The steakhouse smelled of expensive bourbon and arrogance. I sat at the end of the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the condensation drip down my single glass of water. Mark was in his element, leaning back in his leather chair with his suit jacket unbuttoned, gesturing wildly as he held court with his senior partners. He loved these nights. They were his stage, a place where he could play the role of the high-flying provider, the man who carried the world on his shoulders while his little wife stayed tucked away in the safety of the nest he built. I had spent the last 2 hours smiling until my cheeks ached, nodding at anecdotes I'd heard 1,000 times, and playing the part of the silent supporter. When the waiter came around for the second round of drinks, the table erupted in orders for aged scotch and vintage reds. I looked at my empty glass and then at the wine list. I had been nursing a cheap Housewife for 40 minutes. I caught the waiter's eye and started to ask for a glass of the Cabernet, but I didn't even get the name of the vineyard out of my mouth before Mark's hand landed on my forearm. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a weight. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on his boss, Mr. Henderson, while he spoke. He told the waiter that I was fine with water. He said it with a casual, airy dismissal that made my throat tighten. Mark then chuckled, a deep, performative sound that signaled to the table that a joke was coming at my expense. He told the group that he had to keep a tight leash on the household expenses, because Elena didn't quite understand the value of $1. He used the phrase broke housewife while grinning at me, as if it were a pet name rather than a slur against my dignity. He told the senior partners that if he let me manage the money, we'd be living in a cardboard box within a week, because I wouldn't know a P&L statement if it hit me in the face. The table erupted. The partners laughed, that rich, comfortable laugh of men who view their wives as beautiful liabilities. Their wives, draped in silk and diamonds I knew they hadn't paid for, offered me pitying smiles that felt like needles. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, but I didn't snap. I didn't dump the water in his lap. I just looked at him. I looked at the way his expensive watch caught the light, a watch I had researched and found a discount code for 2 years ago, saving him $3,000 he never even noticed was missing. He continued his monologue, explaining to the table that someone had to be the adult in the relationship, and since I didn't have a career of my only job was to stay within the strict budget he provided. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor by letting me exist in his proximity. He spoke as if the roof over my head was a charitable donation he made every month to a helpless cause. I looked down at my plate, the silence of my own voice ringing in my ears. Mark thought he was the architect of our lives. He truly believed that the numbers in our joint account were the beginning and end of our financial reality. He was so busy performing the role of the big earner that he never bothered to look at the details. He didn't see the way I moved money. He didn't see the way I optimized every cent of the gas money he gave me. He laughed, and they laughed with him. But Mark forgot one thing. I wasn't just his wife. I was his accountant. And I knew exactly where his missing money was going. The shift didn't happen overnight. It started 5 years ago, right after Mark got his first major promotion. You'd think a higher salary would mean a more comfortable life for both of us. But for Mark, it was an invitation to build a kingdom where he was the only one with the keys to the treasury. He sat me down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, his face set in that stony, paternalistic expression he used when he was about to help me. He told me that since he was the one bringing in the real income, it was only fair that he took total control of the finances to ensure our future. He called it a protective measure. I called it an allowance. He calculated my life down to the cent. He gave me a strict weekly budget for groceries and gas, based on a spreadsheet he'd designed without ever stepping foot inside a supermarket. He didn't account for inflation, or the price of milk rising, or the fact that my car was older and less fuel efficient than his. Every Sunday night, I had to present him with a stack of physical receipts. If there was a discrepancy of even $5, he'd spend an hour interrogating me about my frivolous spending habits. It was a power trip disguised as fiscal responsibility. He wanted me to feel the weight of my dependence on him every time I swiped a card. So I started to play a different game. If Mark wanted to be a miser, I would be a ghost. I became a master of extreme couponing, spending hours in the middle of the night digital clipping deals and stacking rebates. I learned which stores marked down their meat at 6 a.m. But the real shift happened with the gas money. Mark would check my odometer every few days to make sure I wasn't joyriding on his dime. To keep the numbers looking right while keeping the cash, I stopped driving. I started walking everywhere. I'd trek 3 miles to the grocery store in the humidity of July, lugging heavy bags back until the plastic handles cut deep welts into my palms. I'd take the bus and pay in loose change I found in the couch cushions. Also, I could pocket the $20 he'd allocated for my weekly fuel. While I was sweating through my clothes to save $10, Mark was spending hundreds on networking hobbies. He bought a set of custom-fitted golf clubs that cost more than my first car. He joined a cigar club where the monthly dues could have paid our mortgage. He justified it all as an investment in his personal brand. He looked at my worn-out sneakers and my fading wardrobe as proof that I was just naturally frugal, or perhaps just lacking his refined taste. He'd pat my head and tell me he appreciated how low maintenance I was. It was the ultimate insult wrapped in a compliment. He truly believed he had broken my spirit and turned me into a grateful beggar. He never asked why I looked so tired or why the car sat in the driveway for days on end. He was too busy admiring his own reflection in the polished chrome of his life. He thought I was walking to the store to save his money. I was walking to the store to fund my war chest. The transition from a housewife to a trader didn't happen in a flashy office with multiple monitors. It happened at 3 in the morning on a cracked smartphone screen, illuminated by the dim light of the refrigerator. Every dollar I scavenged from the grocery budget, and every cent of the unspent gas money went into a separate, digital world that Mark didn't know existed. I had opened a brokerage account using my maiden name and a P.O. box 2 towns over. At first it was pathetic. I started with a mere $20. It felt like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. But while Mark was sleeping off his expensive bourbon, I was studying. I wasn't just gambling, I was obsessive. I read every white paper, followed every market trend, and learned the brutal mechanics of day trading. I specialized in high-volatility microcaps because I didn't have the luxury of slow growth. I needed every penny to work like a soldier. Over those 1,825 days, the math began to shift in my favor. Compounding interest is a quiet, lethal force. That first $20 became $50. $50 became $200. By the end of the second year, my grocery savings had swelled into a few thousand. I learned to ride the waves of the market with a cold, detached precision that Mark never could have imagined. While he was at his office feeling powerful because he controlled the household thermostat, I was making moves that would have made his senior partners sweat. I took the scraps he threw me and turned them into a weapon. I never withdrew a single cent. I lived on the edge of the budget he gave me, wearing shoes with thin soles and using the same bottle of shampoo for 3 months, all to ensure my capital stayed untouched. I was hungry, I was tired, and I was completely focused. I treated that portfolio like a living thing that needed to be protected from his arrogance. Last week, while Mark was in the shower whistling a tune and thinking about his next status purchase, I logged in to check the final tally of 5 years of silence. I sat on the edge of the bed, my breath hitching in my chest as the app loaded. The number on the screen wasn't just a figure, it was a certificate of freedom. The balance sat at $342,000. It was more than his entire annual salary before taxes. It was enough to walk away and never look back. It was the physical manifestation of every mile I had walked to the store and every no I had said to myself while he said yes to everything he wanted. I felt a surge of triumph so sharp it almost hurt. I was no longer the broke housewife he mocked at dinner parties. I was a woman with a fortress. But the high didn't last. To finalize my exit strategy, I needed to see exactly how much was left in our joint emergency fund so I could leave my half on the table and be done with him legally. I logged into our shared bank portal, expecting to see the $30,000 we were supposed to have saved for a house down payment. Instead, the screen showed a balance of $412. I stared at the screen, refreshing the page, certain it was a technical error. It wasn't. The history showed a series of massive, recurring withdrawals over the last 18 months. There were payments to an investment group I'd never heard of and thousands of dollars spent at luxury boutiques and hotels in a city Mark supposedly only visited for one-day business trips. The man who lectured me about the price of a glass of wine had been hemorrhaging our future into a black hole of deceit. The total was more than his annual salary. But then, I checked the joint account, and my blood ran cold. Mark had been lying too. I used to spend my Sundays as a shadow architect. I would spend hours meticulously planning Mark's week, so he could glide through his existence without ever feeling a single bump in the road. I coordinated his dry cleaning so his shirts were crisp for every board meeting. I spent my allowance on the specific, expensive organic coffee beans he insisted were the only ones that didn't give him a headache. I spent my mental energy tracking the maintenance on his car, the expiration of his professional licenses, and the birthdays of his most influential clients. I was the oil in the machine of his ego, and I did it all while he reminded me that I was a financial burden. But that Monday morning the machine stopped. I didn't wake him up when he slept through his third alarm. I didn't prepare the green juice that he swore kept his brain sharp. I simply sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, watching him scramble. The first cut was the most subtle. Mark relied on me to move money between his various personal accounts to cover his lifestyle subscriptions, the wine clubs, the premium gym membership, and the satellite radio for his SUV. I simply stopped doing it. I let the payments fail. I miscalculated the grocery budget so that by Wednesday, the fridge held nothing but a half-empty jar of pickles and some wilted celery. When he came home and asked what was for dinner, I told him I'd run out of the gas money he gave me and couldn't make it to the store. I watched his face turn a blotchy, frustrated red as he realized he'd have to spend his own fun money on something as mundane as a rotisserie chicken. By Thursday, the friction was unbearable. He tried to buy a round of drinks for his friends after work, only to have his card declined because I hadn't reminded him to transfer funds from his secret, dwindling reserve into his checking account. He came home fuming, slamming his keys on the counter. He looked at me with a level of contempt that should have broken me. But instead, it felt like a cold breeze on a hot day. He demanded to know where the money went. He started a frantic, clumsy audit of the kitchen drawers, looking for receipts, screaming that I was incompetent, and that I was flushing his hard-earned cash down the toilet. He actually used the word charity again, claiming that he was tired of supporting a woman who couldn't even keep the lights on without a manual. I let him scream. I let him pace the kitchen floor, until he was out of breath. For years, I had apologized for the way the world worked, taking the blame for every financial hiccup just to keep the peace. Not this time. I waited for the silence, then I looked him dead in the eye. I told him that perhaps he was right. If I was truly as broke and financially illiterate as he claimed, then I was clearly a danger to our household stability. I told him that from this moment on, I would no longer touch the bills, the scheduling, or the budgeting. I told him he should handle every single cent himself, since he was the only one who understood the value of $1. His jaw dropped. He wasn't prepared for a strike. He was prepared for an apology. He was so used to me groveling for an extra $20 that he didn't realize I had just handed him a death sentence of administrative chaos. He was a man who couldn't find the spare light bulbs without calling me. And now he was in charge of a crumbling empire. He realized, for the first time, that he had no idea how to manage the life he bragged about. He screamed that I was being hysterical. He screamed that I was incompetent. I just smiled and told him if I was so broke, maybe he should manage the bills himself. That's when he made the mistake of calling his mother. Mark's mother, Barbara, has always viewed me as a parasite clinging to her golden son's success. Within 3 hours of Mark's panicked phone call to her, the first stone was cast. I was sitting in the dark of our living room, the blue light of my phone reflecting off my glasses, watching the notification bell on my social media feed begin to scream. Barbara hadn't just called to comfort him. She had gone to war on the digital front. She posted a long, rambling manifesto on her public Facebook page, accompanied by a picture of Mark looking tired and stressed. A photo she'd taken months ago during a flu, repurposed now to look like the face of a man being worked to death by a demanding wife. The post was a masterpiece of toxic manipulation. She described me as a lazy, gold-digging daughter-in-law who had spent years bleeding her hard-working son dry, while contributing nothing but a shopping habit to the household. She claimed that I had finally snapped, refusing to even cook a meal for a man who provided me with a life of luxury. She used the word financial abuse, a term she clearly didn't understand but knew would trigger the neighborhood's protective instincts. She painted a picture of a saintly provider being bullied in his own home by a woman who wouldn't have a roof over her head if it weren't for his infinite patience. It was a call to arms, and the community was more than happy to answer. By midnight, the dog pile was in full swing. Neighbors I'd shared tea with and friends from the local charity guild were chiming in with their own observations. One woman, whose lawn I'd helped her weed just last summer, commented that she always thought I looked shifty when I walked to the grocery store, implying I was hiding something. Another neighbor claimed he'd seen me squandering Mark's money on expensive packages, likely referring to the bulk buy toilet paper I ordered to save us $4 a month. The comments were a toxic sludge of misogyny and classism. They called me a leech, a failure, and a broke housewife who didn't know how lucky she was. Mark sat in the kitchen, just a few feet away from me, scrolling through the same comments. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't defend the woman who had spent 5 years optimizing his life, so he could look like a hero to these very people. Instead, he started liking the comments. He was leaning into the victimhood, soaking up the sympathy like a dry sponge. Every time a new person insulted my character or my intelligence, I could hear him huff a small, self-righteous breath of air. He felt vindicated. He felt that the world finally saw me the way he did, as a useless expense that needed to be trimmed. He thought the public shaming would break me, that I'd come crawling back to the kitchen to make him a sandwich and beg for his forgiveness. He didn't realize that every single comment was a gift. Every insult was a piece of evidence. Every public declaration of my poverty was further proof of the financial narrative he had forced me into. I watched as the share count climbed, the posts spreading through our suburban social circles like a wildfire. Barbara was even tagging my few remaining family members, trying to isolate me completely. She wanted to ensure that when I was eventually cast out, I would have nowhere to go and no reputation left to salvage. She wanted me to be a pariah, a cautionary tale for other, hard-working men in the area. I didn't reply to a single person. I didn't type a defensive, "You don't know the whole story," or try to explain the gas money logic to people who had already made up their minds. I sat there in the silence, my fingers steady as I moved through the thread. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single post. I captured Barbara's lies, Mark's likes, and the vitriol of the neighbors. I organized them into a folder on my cloud drive, right next to the export of my trading portfolio and the records of Mark's secret luxury spending. I felt a strange, cold peace. For years, I had been the only one who knew the truth about our roles. Now they were all putting their ignorance on the record. I let the comments rack up. I screenshotted every insult, because I was about to post a receipt that would shut down the entire neighborhood. The following morning, I didn't get out of bed to make Mark's breakfast. I stayed under the covers with my laptop, the fan whirring against my thighs as I opened a fresh spreadsheet. This wasn't going to be a messy emotional plea. This was going to be an audit. If Mark and his mother wanted to play the game of who owed whom, I was going to provide the definitive scoreboard. I titled the document, "The True Cost of a Broke Housewife," and began to categorize 5 years of stolen life. I didn't start with the emotions. I started with the market rates. I researched the local hourly wage for a private chef, a professional cleaner, a personal assistant, and an estate manager. I calculated the hours I spent performing these roles, adjusting for overtime and weekend surcharges. I was conservative with the numbers, but even then, the subtotal for my labor alone crossed the 6-figure mark. Then came the interest. I tracked every dollar of the gas money I had saved by walking miles in the rain and sun. I didn't just list the cash value. I calculated the opportunity cost. I showed what that money would have been worth if it had been invested in a standard index fund versus what I had actually achieved with my day trading ROI. The contrast was staggering. On one side of the screen, I had my portfolio, a vertical line of growth built on discipline and scraps. On the other side, I began to input the investments I had discovered in Mark's secret history. I found the truth behind the missing $30,000 from our joint savings. He hadn't just been spending it on hotels. He had been pouring money into a crypto mining venture started by one of his drinking buddies. A venture that had collapsed 6 months ago. leaving him with nothing but a pile of worthless hardware and a bruised ego he was trying to heal by berating me. I created a side-by-side comparison chart. I labeled his column, the professional provider, and mine, the broke housewife. Under his name, the losses were highlighted in a bleeding, angry red. The failed side business, the luxury boutique charges for a woman who certainly wasn't me, and the thousands spent on memberships he never used. Under my name, the gains were a steady, clinical green. I calculated the domestic debt he owed me for the 5 years I spent subsidizing his lifestyle, through my own deprivation. I added the reputational damage, tax based on his mother's viral post, charging for the hours of crisis management I would now have to perform to reclaim my name. The final number at the bottom of the spreadsheet wasn't just a bill, it was a ransom. As I worked, the house was silent except for the sound of Mark pacing downstairs. He was likely waiting for me to come down and apologize for causing a scene with his mother. He had no idea that I was currently dismantling the myth of his financial superiority. He thought he was the one holding the leash because he controlled the checking account. He didn't understand that a checking account is just a bucket, and he had been poking holes in his for years while I was building a dam. I looked at the total amount I had amassed in my private brokerage, the $342,000, and compared it to the remaining equity in our home. We had bought the house during a dip in the market, and thanks to the aggressive principal payments I had made using found money in our budget during the first 2 years, we owed very little. I realized that Mark's secret debt and his failed investments had put him in a position where he was technically insolvent. If the bank saw his real numbers, they would pull his lines of credit in a heartbeat. He was a house of cards, and I was the wind. I didn't just have enough money to move into a nice apartment or start a new life in a different city. I had enough liquid capital to satisfy the remaining mortgage and purchase his half of the equity during a forced sale. I sat back and watched the cursor blink at the end of the final row. For 5 years, I had lived in a state of manufactured scarcity. I had counted pennies while he threw away thousands. I had been the broke one because I chose to save him from himself. And his gratitude was to humiliate me in front of his peers and his mother. But the math doesn't lie. The math doesn't care about provider roles or social media narratives. The math only cares about who has the assets and who has the liabilities. Mark was a walking liability. I was the only asset he ever had, and I had just officially delisted him from my life. I realized I didn't just have enough to leave. I had enough to buy the house from under him. And I knew exactly which lawyer would help me do it. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the driveway when Mark's SUV pulled in. I stood by the large bay window, watching him. He climbed out of the car with that practiced, heavy-footed stride of a man who believed he owned every square inch of the earth beneath his boots. He probably expected to walk through the front door to the smell of a home-cooked meal and the sight of a broken wife ready to beg for his financial mercy. He didn't know that 3 hours ago, a locksmith had finished the final cylinder, or that his entire life had been condensed into 24 heavy-duty cardboard boxes currently stacked like a wall in the garage. I heard the frantic metallic clicking of his key struggling against the new lock. He tried once, twice, then began to shoulder the door, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt. When I finally unbolted the door and stood in the frame, he didn't ask what was wrong. He immediately launched into a tirade. He started screaming about his rights, about how this was his house, paid for with his blood, sweat, and tears, while I sat around playing house. He used that booming boardroom voice, the one designed to make subordinates tremble. He told me that I was having a mental breakdown, and that if I didn't step aside and let him into his home, he would cut me off completely. Not a cent more for groceries. No more roof. No more charity. He was leaning into the role of the provider one last time, trying to use the threat of poverty to leash me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to match his. I simply turned around and walked into the kitchen, leaving the door open just enough for him to follow. I sat down at the island and turned the laptop toward him. The screen was split. On the left was the official notification from our joint bank. A document I'd accessed using the credentials he thought I was too dim to remember. It was a formal notice of default. Because of his secret, reckless investments and the thousands he'd siphoned off for his mistress, He had missed 3 consecutive bridge loan payments he'd taken out against the house. He was 3 weeks away from a foreclosure filing. He wasn't the provider. He was the squatter. On the right side of the screen was my brokerage statement. I pointed to the bottom line, the $342,000 in liquid assets. I pointed to the trade history, the 5 years of $20 wins, the compound interest, and the aggressive shorts I had executed while he was out playing golf. I told him, quite calmly, that while he was busy losing our future on crypto mining and ego trips, the broke housewife had been building a lifeboat. I told him that I had already been in contact with the bank's asset recovery department. I was prepared to buy the debt and the deed in a private sale, using the very money he thought I was spending on gas. Mark's face went through a terrifying transformation. The red flush of anger drained away, replaced by a sickly gray pallor. He stared at the numbers, his eyes darting back and forth between the foreclosure notice and my portfolio. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was made of paper. But then the denial set in. He let out a sharp, jagged laugh that sounded like breaking glass. He shook his head, pointing a trembling finger at the screen, and told me I was delusional. He said it was a demo account, one of those fake trading simulators people use to feel important. He called me a pathetic liar and reached across the counter, his hands curling into claws. He tried to grab the laptop, intending to smash the evidence of his own inferiority. That's when the doorbell rang. Mark's hand was inches from the laptop when the heavy, authoritative thud of the front door knocker echoed through the hallway. He froze, his fingers twitching in midair. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with a level of pity that seemed to infuriate him more than any scream could have. 2 men were standing on the porch. One was Officer Miller, a man who had patrolled this neighborhood for a decade and had seen Mark's charitable donations to the police gala every year. The other was Marcus Thorne, a divorce attorney whose hourly rate was more than Mark's monthly car payment. Thorne stepped inside first, his silk suit making a soft rustling sound that seemed to command the very air in the room. He didn't look at Mark. He looked at me and nodded, placing a thick manila folder on the kitchen island. He calmly informed Mark that he was representing me in the dissolution of our marriage and the immediate restructuring of our marital assets. Mark tried to laugh it off, turning to the officer with a grin that was far too wide and far too desperate. He told Officer Miller that this was just a little domestic misunderstanding, and that his wife was having some sort of emotional episode. He tried to clap the officer on the shoulder, the way he did at the fundraisers, playing the role of the stable, successful pillar of the community. Officer Miller didn't smile back. He kept his hands hooked into his vest, his eyes tracking the frantic, sweating man in front of him. Thorne cleared his throat and opened the folder, spreading out a series of documents that I had prepared months in advance. He pointed to the asset protection clauses and the paper trail of Mark's unauthorized withdrawals from our joint accounts. He explained, in a voice as cold as a surgical blade, that Mark's secret debt and his attempts to hide marital funds constituted financial misconduct. Mark started to unravel. The provider mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He began to shout, his voice cracking as he accused me of stealing from him, of being a broke housewife who had somehow hacked his life. He lunged toward the folder, but the officer stepped in, his hand resting firmly on the handle of his belt. The contrast was absolute. I stood perfectly still, a woman of means and composure, while the successful executive was reduced to a sputtering, red-faced mess in his own kitchen. Thorne handed the officer a printout of my trading portfolio alongside the default notice on the house. He explained that I wasn't just a spouse. I was the primary stakeholder in the property's remaining equity, due to the domestic labor credit, and the capital I was prepared to inject to save the home from his negligence. Mark started sobbing then, a pathetic, wet sound that filled the room. He kept repeating that it was his money, his house, his life. He looked at the officer, pleading for him to understand that a housewife couldn't possibly have more than him. The officer looked at the numbers. He saw the systematic way Mark had drained our security for his ego, and the systematic way I had rebuilt a fortress from the crumbs. He looked at the calm, professional woman I had become, and then at the man currently trembling on the floor. The officer looked at Mark's bank statements and then at mine. He didn't see a broke housewife. He saw a titan. And Mark. He saw his life ending. The collapse of Mark's carefully curated world didn't happen with a bang. It happened with the clinical silence of a revoked security badge. 2 weeks after the scene in our kitchen, Mark was called into a private meeting with Mr. Henderson. Without me there to manage his calendar, proofread his reports, or remind him of the sensitive details regarding his clients' personal lives, his performance had plummeted. But the final nail was the reputation I had spent years protecting. When the truth of his financial instability and his crypto mining debt leaked out, along with the legal filings from my attorney, his firm decided he was a liability they could no longer afford. They didn't want a status seeker who couldn't even manage his own household debt. He was escorted from the building with his status hobbies packed into the same cardboard boxes I had used for his clothes. While Mark was losing his office, his mother, Barbara, was losing her mind. The Facebook post she had used to crucify me had backfired spectacularly. When the receipts of Mark's luxury spending and my secret, self-made fortune began to circulate through the neighborhood grapevine, the community's sympathy curdled into mockery. People who had once pitted her for having a leech for a daughter-in-law were now whispering about how she had raised a man who nearly bankrupted his family, while his wife saved him from the shadows. She showed up at my door, the door I now owned outright after buying the mortgage note from the bank, not with insults, but with a shaking chin and a damp tissue. She sat in my living room, the same room where she had once lectured me on how to be a dutiful wife. She told me that Mark was staying on her couch, that he was depressed, and that her own finances were tighter than expected. She eventually got to the point. She needed a loan. She claimed that the family needed to stick together, and that surely I had enough extra money to help her keep her own house. It was a staggering display of audacity. She was begging the broke housewife for a handout to save the very home where she had plotted my social execution. I let her finish her tea before I opened my tablet. I didn't give her a check. Instead, I showed her a document I had acquired through a secondary private equity firm I'd started with a portion of my trading profits. Barbara had taken out a predatory home equity line of credit 3 years ago to fund Mark's business ventures, and the debt had been sold twice. I had tracked it down and bought it for pennies on the dollar. I didn't just have her mortgage, I was her landlord. I did the same for the remaining 3 years of payments on Mark's precious SUV. I owned the car he used to drive to his networking events. I owned the roof over his mother's head. I held their entire existence in the palm of my hand, and I had used the gas money he gave me to buy the leash. Barbara's face went white, a mirror image of the expression Mark had worn. She started to cry, calling me cold and heartless. She used the word monster, her voice trembling as she asked how I could do this to people I had called family for years. She couldn't understand how the woman who used to clip coupons and walk to the store in the rain could be the same woman who had systematically dismantled their lives. She expected me to be the saint, one last time. To forgive the debt and play the role of the merciful provider they had never been to me. I stood up and walked her to the door. I told her that for 5 years, I was exactly what they wanted me to be. I was the silent, invisible support system that allowed them to feel superior. I was the broke one so they could feel rich. I reminded her of the dinner party, of Mark's toast to his broke housewife, while his colleagues laughed at my expense. I told her that I was simply fulfilling the role they had assigned me. If I was truly a broke housewife with no financial sense, then surely they couldn't expect me to be responsible for their financial salvation. They had spent years telling the world I was nothing. They couldn't be surprised when nothing was exactly what I had to give them. They called me a monster for not sharing. I reminded them of the broke housewife toast. I was just living up to the name he gave me. The air here doesn't smell like expensive bourbon or the stale desperation of a suburban kitchen. It smells like salt and possibilities. I am sitting on a private balcony overlooking the coast of a city where nobody knows Mark's name, and nobody cares about my status as a housewife. My new laptop is open in front of me, its screen displaying a clean green interface. I don't have to hide it anymore. I don't have to trade in the dark or wait for the sound of a shower to check my positions. I am the only one who holds the password to my life, and the silence is the most expensive thing I've ever bought. Back home, the fallout is still settling. Mark managed to find a job, but it's a shadow of his former career, A mid-level sales position that requires him to account for every mile he drives. The irony isn't lost on me. He lives in a small apartment while I decide whether to sell the house I took from him, or keep it as a rental property, just to remind him who owns the ground he walks on. His mother doesn't post on Facebook anymore. The community that once dogpiled me has moved on to a new scandal. Though I hear their whispers turn to hushed awe whenever my name is mentioned. They realize too late that the woman they mocked for counting pennies was actually counting their days. There is a specific kind of power in being underestimated. When people see a woman who saves, who stays quiet, and who optimizes the crumbs of a budget, they assume she is small. They assume she is doing it out of necessity or fear. They never stop to consider that she might be doing it out of strategy. I spent 5 years being the broke one, and in that time, I learned more about the world than Mark ever did with his high-stakes lunches. I learned that wealth isn't about what you earn, it's about what you keep. I close my laptop and watch the tide come in. Mark is still paying me back, 1 cent at a time, through a court-ordered settlement that he'll be tethered to for the next decade. If you think your quiet partner doesn't know the math, check your gas receipts. You might be funding your own replacement.